Now can we take Donald Trump seriously? The real estate mogul and reality TV star won big Tuesday in the New Hampshire primary, with no clear moderate emerging from a still crowded field to challenge the populist New Yorker who's upended conventional strategy every step of the way. As improbable, the 21-point shellacking by Bernie Sanders of his only rival on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton. How can it be that faced with an unabashed socialist who's not even a member of her party, the former First Lady and Secretary of State suddenly seems very beatable? Can these political outsiders actually win with an outgoing president who's often been dubbed no drama Obama? What's drawing voters to candidates that couldn't be more different in their style and substance? What's changed over 8 years in the United States? Today, in the François debate, we're seeing how Trump and Sanders have raged against the machine. And with us from the University of New Hampshire, Dante Scala, the co-author of The Four Faces of the Republican Party. Many thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.
Also joining us, she's the author of America After Obama. Amy Green teaches at the prestigious French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And we welcome from Washington, D.C., Jim Marquettes, president of 4D PAC, a political action committee that supports strong-on-security Democrats. I take it that means Hillary Clinton this time around.
It does indeed. Thanks for having me.
All right. And from Tallahassee, Florida, we welcome back Rick Wilson, Republican Party strategist. Rick, who are you supporting?
I'm with Marco Rubio this campaign cycle. He had a tough night the other night, but we're sticking with him, and he's still in the fight. All
right, we'll broach that in a moment. The France debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the numbers. Donald Trump garnering more than 1/3 of the vote, leaving his rivals depleted as his thoughts turn to South Carolina in 10 days' time.
I wanted to congratulate the other candidates, okay? Now that I got that over with. You know, it's always tough, and then tomorrow, boom, boom.
Dante Scala, that kind of unfiltered stream of consciousness, how could it play so well in New Hampshire, which has this reputation of being a state where people are very cautious and in control?
Yeah, this is a state where the Republican establishment is, I think they pulled the covers over their heads today and tried to pretend last night didn't happen, because it was a night in which political outsiders, not just Donald Trump, but voters as well, showed up. They weren't the elites leading the charge, but rather Donald Trump was leading the charge against the elites, against the gatekeepers of the New Hampshire Republican Party. And unfiltered, raw, vulgar, all of that was true of Donald Trump, and his support for months was remarkably steady. And we all watched and waited and thought, well, maybe New Hampshire voters will get cold feet at the last minute. Maybe they won't show up to vote. But neither one of those things happened. If anything, his poll numbers were a bit better, or his final numbers were a bit better than his poll numbers indicated.
What drew them to him?
I think on the one hand, white working class voters found a champion in Donald Trump. And this is a group of voters who have become increasingly important to the Republican National Coalition, and yet Republicans haven't offered them the policies that they feel will help them with their economic problems, their families in peril, their concerns about the next generation, their children, and so forth. There's a lot of anxiety out there, and Trump has been, had a message that resonates with them in a way that other candidates just couldn't find a way to do.
Now, let me ask you about this, because you speak of the four faces of the Republican Party. You break down Republican voters into four categories. what is it? More socially liberal, more conservative, very conservative, and
well, there are four groups.
Go ahead, talk us through it.
There are moderates. Sure, there are moderate voters. There are somewhat conservative voters who are really the swing voters in every single Republican primary. They're reliably conservative, but not very conservative. There are very conservative evangelicals, such as we find in the Iowa caucuses and now in the southern primaries to come. And then there are very conservative secular voters who are more liberty Republicans, constitutionalists, flat taxers, Steve Forbes fans, those sorts of voters.
And Donald Trump doesn't fit into any of these categories?
Well, the funny thing about Trump is that he draws support from just about all of those categories, with the exception of the very conservative evangelicals. So far, Ted Cruz has emerged as the champion of those voters. But as far as the other three, New Hampshire is a largely secular state. And what was striking was how Trump kind of built a coalition of voters across these different categories. And Trump is very difficult to pin down ideologically. On immigration, of course, sounds very conservative, restrictionist, and so forth. But on other issues, trade, Social Security, he sounds rather moderate. So he's as odd as it seems, this person, this bomb thrower, has become something of a coalition builder, at least in the state of New Hampshire.
Rick Wilson, what is your strategy then?
Well, the main thing about Trump that actually I think is the unspoken truth here is that we have two things going on. One, Trump has a built-in celebrity factor that no other candidate can rival. The second thing is that Donald Trump is taking a great advantage of the fact that although his numbers are bounded up at around 30-35% as a general rule, the field is so heavily divided between everyone else in the mainstream conservative lane that you end up dividing Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, John Kasich, Chris Christie. So the peanut butter gets spread very thin for where the other Republicans can go. So this triumph of Donald Trump is something that, we're not seeing him grow his number particularly strongly outside of that boundary, that 30% boundary or so, the mid-30 boundary. And as the other folks drop out of this race, you're going to see their support going to other candidates in the Republican field. So Chris Christie today is pulling out of the race. And so you'll probably see Christie voters spreading between Kasich and Bush and Rubio. Ben Carson is rumored to be coming out of the race. So you'll probably see those spread between Cruz and Rubio. So you're going to end up with a coalition against Trump that gets smaller and smaller, but the number of total votes gets bigger and bigger. So when you have the question though is when, and let me get back to your get back to your first point, Rick Wilson, because we know the United States elected an actor, but he was a Hollywood actor. That was Ronald Reagan. In this particular case, it's a reality TV star, and as you say, people know him. He's a familiar face. Sure, they believe they know the character he plays on TV, which is why. Although, and none of the candidates have yet really attacked Donald Trump with any significant media firepower. We've got a couple of $1 million spread out between Ted Cruz in Iowa and a little bit in New Hampshire, but for the most part, nobody's laid a glove on this guy about the things that peel back what that TV character is. We've been working for a super PAC that's put out a couple of ads that have gone after the Trump economic record and talked about the fact that this guy isn't really who he says he is, that he's a very self-driven individual. He's a very, very, avaricious businessman who has left small vendors and people holding the bag when his businesses failed in the past. And we know that that's the only thing so far that in the testing, the focus group testing and the poll testing has worked to move Trump voters away from him, is to reveal the actual economic history of this guy.
Jim Markakis, do you agree to beat Trump, the other Republican candidates are going to have to tackle him head on instead of sidestepping him?
Absolutely. I think there are two really good points there. One is this idea. I think the watchword of this election is authenticity. And Donald Trump has been able to speak from the hip. He's been able to channel the anger that a lot of voters have expressed. If you think about it, for basically the last 20 or 30 years, the establishment wings of both parties have sort of said the same things, right? Like on the Democratic side, it's mostly support the middle class, and then recently it's been environmentalism and things like that. On the Republican side, it's been low taxes and low regulations. What we've got to in this election is voters have sort of tired of that. They see the gridlock in Washington. They see how so few things are getting accomplished. And Donald Trump speaks to that anger. So because he's sort of presented himself as this authentic, I'm going to tell it like it really is guy, I think Rick's point is absolutely correct. You have to reveal the fact that he has a very mixed record and attack his greatest strength and sort of unveil who Donald Trump actually is.
But every time we've seen in debates the other candidates attack him, he just sort of brushes it all off, takes it all in stride, and answers with even more stinging attacks.
Well, I think part of the problem is it took a long time for the rest of the Republican field to realize that they actually have to attack this guy. For the first several months Donald Trump was in the race, he was sort of treated as a joke. Don't worry, he's not going to win anything. Yeah, he's loud and he's brash, but maybe he's not going to go anywhere. The silver lining we saw coming out of New Hampshire, and you alluded to it in the earlier points, is when you have the combined voter totals of a Rubio and a Kasich and a Bush and a Christie, all of a sudden you combine those, and then that becomes very competitive with Donald Trump's mid-30 races. I think, personally, as a moderate Democrat, and somebody who values my country and the outcome of this election, I don't want I don't want Hillary Clinton to end up running against a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz, because there's even the slightest chance that they could win the presidency of the United States should strike fear into the vast majority of Americans. The challenge for the Republican Party now moving forward is that they have to coalesce around a moderate. And I don't actually know that Marco Rubio is a moderate. I think he presents himself very well, but is actually extremely conservative. Right. But of the Bush, Kasich, Christie group, I think the Republican establishment has to work very hard to get several of those folks out of the race as quickly as possible so the vote does not remain divided amongst them in the face of a challenge to Donald Trump.
All right, we're going to talk about the rest of the Republican field in a moment. First, though, this question that you mentioned there, authenticity. Bernie Sanders, in his victory speech on the Democratic side, he seemed to have that same tone as he relished that role of outsider. Let's listen.
9 months ago, we began our campaign here in New Hampshire. We had no campaign organization. We had no money because of a huge voter turnout. And I say huge. We won.
And there's that word huge that Donald Trump fashions. A bit of a wink there, it seems, to the Republican frontrunner.
Well, it isn't new that journalists and pundits have been comparing some of the fervor for Bernie Sanders with that of Donald Trump. They tap into some of the same resentment of the establishment on both sides. They both have messages of this so-called authenticity, which appeals to voters both on the left and on the right. So it's possible that there was a nod to Donald Trump in that speech, perhaps starting to position Sanders as a sort of front-runner candidate who has a real shot at the nomination.
And who's been perhaps underestimated by the rest of the field?
Who's perhaps been underestimated by the rest of the field, although the victory in New Hampshire wasn't exactly a surprise. It's not something I think that will fundamentally change the course of the Democratic race, although it does certainly give Sanders momentum in terms of fundraising, in terms of positioning himself for future states. But that doesn't change the fact that Clinton still has a superior infrastructure, still has overwhelming support among the identity sort of demographic coalitions that are necessary to win the Democratic nomination.
All right, Hillary Clinton, who was gracious after her loss and made no pretense of hiding her blind spots.
I know I have some work to do, particularly with young people, but I will repeat again what I have said this week. Even if they are not supporting me now, I support them. Because I know I've had a blessed life, but I also know what it's like to stumble and fall. And so many people across America know that feeling. And we've learned it's not whether you get knocked down that matters, it's whether you get back up.
Jim Markakis, what's making it difficult, it seems, you talked about authenticity a few minutes ago. What's making it difficult, it seems, for Hillary Clinton is she doesn't seem to show that she's speaking from the gut in the same way that her rival is.
Well, I think there's a very important point there. The idea that Bernie Sanders is going to lead some sort of revolution is an absolute joke. He paints himself as this harbinger of massive change, yet the actions that he and his campaign have undertaken fully undercuts that message in the same way we were just talking about with Donald Trump a few minutes ago. Bernie Sanders is a convenient Democrat when he wants to. That doesn't really seem very revolutionary to me. This is a guy who decries big money, yet he attends mega donor fundraisers on Martha's Vineyard and accepts Democratic Party money that is funded by Wall Street when he talks about how he hates Wall Street so much. This doesn't seem like a revolutionary. It doesn't seem very revolutionary when Bernie Sanders allows his campaign to access data and basically steal it from the Democratic National Committee. So if I were in the Hillary Clinton campaign, I would turn around and attack him very strongly on this idea that Bernie Sanders is somehow the authentic candidate. If you pivot to Hillary Clinton, she had a very good line in her speech last night where she said, look, I understand that there's a lot of anger out there. And that's what Bernie Sanders has done. He's talked about the anger in the country. But she pivots and says, I'm the one who has worked to accomplish things throughout my entire career. Bernie Sanders doesn't really have a record of accomplishment. You can go back and look at 35 to 40 years of what Hillary Clinton has done, reaching out to the other side, to friends and enemies alike, to make sure that she can make real differences in people's lives. And whether that's things like the S-chip healthcare plan in the 90s, to expand healthcare to low-income children, whether it's ensuring $21 billion of federal aid to help New York rebuild after 9/11, whether it's starting the Clinton Foundation with her husband to lift 400 million people out of poverty in 180 countries, whether it's as Secretary of State negotiating the New START deal to limit nuclear weapons with Russia, to advocate for women's rights around the world. All of these things are real, tangible benefits. So in the next few weeks, we're going to see Bernie Sanders run into a buzzsaw when we get to states like Nevada and South Carolina that are not open primaries, that are limited to real members of the Democratic Party. And that are traditionally more diverse. She's going to be able to point to that record of success and be able to say that she has a message that goes to the Democratic Party's base.
All right, a lot of points there, and I'll pick up just on one of them. First of all, Hillary Clinton having a long track record. Is that a good thing or not? I read one quote of one pundit saying, is moderate now become a dirty word?
It's interesting when you bring up the topic, because there's always, with Hillary Clinton, with the Clintons in general, this question of, has America reached the point of Clinton fatigue? They have a well-beaten trail in the 1990s. They're sort of associated with some of the partisan rancor. And so there's the question of whether or not Americans want to turn the page to something different. Are they ready for a real change, a sort of renewal of the faces that represent their leadership? So the question is there the fatigue there? But of course, Hillary Clinton does have this long track record to work on. She's selling this as the center of her campaign, that she's able to get things done. One of the difficulties about her position...
But is Sanders doing a better job in selling the fact that...
Sanders is able to promote one sort of unified message. And it's about economic inequality. It's very appealing, especially to young people who are perhaps angry with the reach of money in the political process. They're overwhelmed with student loan burden. They see that their job prospects are perhaps less than those of their parents. So they see this sort of future that's marked by great uncertainty. And the Sanders message perhaps resonates. But when you look at the fact that Hillary Clinton is also running on her long record, her ability to get things done, perhaps among young voters, that's not as inspiring. Voters don't want to say, look, let's get things done. This is the best we can hope for, is sort of pragmatism. They want to know what is the sort of vision into which they're voting. Of course, I think that in the long run, Hillary Clinton's got amazing infrastructure. She has a record of accomplishment. She has support. So I think that will all come into play as this primary race pursues itself.
All right, I want to get the rest of the panel's view on the tone of the campaign on the Democratic side when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.